Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Hello and welcome, my dear students. I hope all of you are okay. Today, as you know, we will discuss together 18th century literatures, which started from 1700 up to 1800. And the chapter number 9 is talking about this topic. But before we are going to discuss the chapter number 9, let me remind you also about chapter number 8, which was talking about the restoration period. In restoration period, if you remember that I told you about first of all the definitions of restorations we discussed together, and we say that I told you that the restoration literature I consider as an English literature written during the historical period. Also, we discussed together the first literary characteristics of this term, which was talking about Johnny Dryden, and how Johnny Dryden as an English poet over or introduced to this movement. We consider Johnny Dryden, I told you, as a literary critic, a translator, playwright, and also I told you about Dryden's how he influenced on literatures. Also, if you remember that in general, we talk about the summary of the Restoration period and how it changed, and King Charles II, how he brought the throne to the people of England, and how people of England were suffering from tension due to the strict rule of Cromwell. So all these things we discuss in chapter number 8 and finish. Now today we are going to talk about chapter number 9 and talk about the 18th century, but we can't cover the whole chapter. I mean here chapter number 9. I can't cover all the chapter, but today I'll give you four sections, and other four sections next lecture we will cover inshallah. So move with me to this slide and see what it contains. The first one I'll discuss to Augustan or a classical age. The second is the classical age. The third is Alexander Pope in 1688 up to 1744, and finally Samuel Johnson in 1709 up to 1784. All these sections I'll cover today in this lecture one by one, and I hope that you follow me and understand every point, because it is very important chapters and very long. So therefore, if you open and look at this slice, first of all, you will find that the definitions of a new classical age. You know that we have one, two, three, four, 5 points on in these definitions. But before we go to these definitions, let me tell you about the Augustan literatures in general. I mean that I consider it as a style of a British literatures, which produced during the reign of a Queen and or King George I. So the first half of the 18th century, the first half of the 18th century, and ending in the I think 1740s, with the death of Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift in 1744 up to 1745. So therefore, if you look at the first point here, you will find that the 18th century in English literature has been called the new classical age. True or false? I can make a question here. The 18th century in English literature has been called the new classical age. I can make the 20th century or the 15th century in order to change the true to be false. So this is important here to underline and continue with me. Augustan age. So I can say a new classical age in the 18th century, or Augustan age, and also the age of reason. So I have three names here. One is by 18th century, we can call the first is a new classical age. The second, we can call this age as Augustan age, and the third, the age of reason. This is the first point of definitions. The second point here is that the term the Augustan age comes from the self-conscious imitations of the original Augustan writers, Virgils and Horace, by many of the writers of the period. The third is specifically the new classical age was the period after the best or orations era of the death of Alexander Pope. And later I'll tell you many things about Alexander Pope. All right. The major writers of the age were Pope and Johnson's. These two writers are the major writers of this, as you know, age. The third is Dryden, also in poetry, and Jonathan Swift and Joseph Addison's in prose. Finally, new classical period ended in 1798 when Wordsworth published the Romantic Lyrical Ballad. So therefore, this is the first definition of Augustan age, which we can also add it here that I can say Pope and Swift here in 1744. We respect them that they prove or introduce many things, many advantage things in the 18th century. So it was literary epoch or that features the rapid developments of the novel. In 18th century, we consider that the developments of the novel was an explosion or in satire and also drama from political satires into melodrama also in this period. So also we can say that the evolution towards poetry of personal explosion in philosophy also it was an age in increasing let me say the writings of political economic or economy, and it marks the evolutions of uh, I can say formal philosophy and development of capitalism and the all of the trade. So therefore, it is very important to keep these points in your mind and read it in order to understand what 18th century writers or what we call 18th century at that time. So let us move to the another introductions of this and continue classical age or the Augustan age in literatures, the age of good sense or the age of reasons, as just now we say. Though Dryden belonged to the 17th century, he is also included in the classical or Augustan age, as during his time the characteristics of his age had manifested themselves and he himself represented them to great extent. Other great literary, here is important, you have to underline, other great literary figures who dominated this age successively were Pope and Dr. Johnson's. We can say Johnson's or Johnson or Dr. Johnson's, as they say. Augustan or Classical Age. The first half of the 18th century is remarkable for the rapid social developments in England. The second, in the later half of the century, the political and social progress is almost purely. The third is schools were established, clubs and coffee houses increased, books and magazines multiple until the press was the greatest visible power in England. You see here, now this is the advantage of this age. You see what is the first, the second, what is the third also. You can see here schools established, clubs, as we say, coffee houses increase, and all these things we find also magazine in this age. All right. So one of the most critical elements I can say here of the 18th century was the increasing available of the printed materials. This is means that the most important critical of this age, 18th century I mean, is that the available of the printed material for readers and authors, both for readers and authors. So boxes here fell in price dramatically, and used boxes were sold in fairs and other fairs. So additionally, I can say that in a cheap box and broadsheets carried London's and informations out of the reaches in kingdom. So this is what the in this century we achieve, yes. So look here, the poetry of the first half of the century as typified in the work of Pope and published and witty enough but artificial. In the literatures of the preceding age, we noted two marked tendencies: the tendency of the to realism in subject matter, and the tendency to polish and refinement of expressions. So here, by these, let me say, tendencies, now I'll discuss to you after this short paragraph. Nearly every writer of the first half of the century was used and rewarded by Wang or Tories for satirizing their enemies and for advancing their special political interests. So here, all types I can see here, or both these tendencies, both these tendencies were continue in the Augustan age and are seen clearly in poetry of Pope, who brought the couplet of perfections, and in also the prose of Addison. So a third tendency also is shown here in the prevalence of satires resulting from the unfortunate unions of politics with literatures. So we have already noted the power of the press in this age, and also we will discuss later, and the perpetual strife of political parties. So this is what we mean by the Augustan age or Augustan literatures. Let us now here talk about the Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope, as you see here, born in 1688 up to 1744, and he was an English poet also. We consider him as a satirist during the Restoration. He was born in London, exactly, into a Roman Catholic family. From childhood, Pope suffered from a spinal deformity. Spinal deformity, I mean here يعني نقصد تشوهات في العمود الفقري, spinal deformity that left him disabled, and also it prevented him from every growing past the highest of Alexander Pope, at least 4.6. So Pope's here formal education was sadly limited because of his religious view. So during restorations, Catholics here were uh, uh, let me say, persecuted, and Pope's religion prevented him from attending public schools. Despite also he learned some Latin and Greek from various tutors, and became an avid reader, and aspired to become a great poet. So he had the advantage of becoming part of a literary subcultural among other Roman Catholics living near him. So this is at least a short autobiography about Alexander Pope. And if you look here at this slice, you will find that Pope was an 18th century English poet. This is first, best known for his satirical verse and for his translations of Homer. He is the third most frequently quoted writer in the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations, after William Shakespeare and Alfred Tennyson. An essay on criticism is one of the most major poems written by Pope. Despite the titles, the poem is not as much an original analysis as the completion of Pope's readings of different ancients. It is also the only significant critical treatise in English written in verse. It is famous for its published line or polished, sorry, line, many of which have become proverbial. So to err is human, to forgive is divine. Proverbial we consider these lines as to err is a human, to forgive is divine. This is by Alexander Pope. So this is now also about Pope's work. If you look at these styles here, what he offer or what is about his works. Pope, first of all, pastorals here, the first work of him. The second is essay on criticism, a didactic poem in heroic couplets. The Rape of Luck also we consider as a masterpieces, and now, just now later, I'll tell you about the Rape of the Luck. Here, the summary of it or plot. The masterpieces, which is worth reading for its description and satire of the dull cart life of England of that time. So this is what Pope introduced. Now look about the Rape of the Luck here. The Rape of the Luck was written by Alexander Pope. We can change Alexander Pope and put another writers or novelists here. Now, and first published in 1712, then reworked and published again in 1714. The poem is a mock epic that satirized the upper classes in London at that time. The story focus on the central characters, Belinda, whose lock of hair is cut off, and a social gathering, although trivial to most. Belinda is outraged that her lock of hair has been cut by the Baron. In the Rape of the Lock, Pope uses Belinda and the Baron to mock two of his acquaintances. Acquaintance here, Arabella Fermor and Lord Peter. The poem follows the events of the night. The events of the night leading here up to the Belinda's heroic load. So this is what we can say or what we can understand from the summary or a brief summary of the Rape of the Luck, that it is first of all a mock epic poem. The first thing you have to keep in your mind that this poem or this story is a novel as we consider is as a mock epic poem. One. The second is the first versions published in 1712 and consisted of two counts. The final versions published in 1714 was expanded to five counts. So based on an actual incident and written to reconcile the families that had been strained by it. So the Rape of the Luck recounts the story of a young woman. We consider it as a young woman who has a lock of hair stolen by an ardent young man. Pop here want to tell us the trivial events in terms usually reserved for incidents of a great moment, such as the quarrel between the Greeks and the Trojans. So the poem here marries a rich range of literatures, illusions, and also an ironic commentary on the contemporary social world with a sense of suppressed energy, creating to break through the veneer of civilizations. You have to read it during your textbook, and you will find in your material everything about the Rape of the Luck because it is important as written by Alexander Pope in 18th century, and consider the 18th century poem as a poem. So here let us talk about another also dramatist here and writers or novelists or poets, also Samuel Johnson's. Samuel Johnson's, as you see here, we will talk about him and what he offered and introduced to 18th century here. Samuel Johnson's, as you see, in 1709 up to 1784, often referred to as Dr. Johnson's, was an English author who made lasting contributions to English literature as a poet, essayist, moralist, literary critic, biographer, editor of lexicographer also. His early works include the poems London and his most impressive poems, The Vanity of Human Wishes in 1749. Let us now move here also to this slide and see Johnson was more than just a lexicographer. He also worked as a journalist at the Gentleman's magazine. He was a biographer, life of Mr. Richard Savage, a poet also in London, a novelist here in Russell, and also a stage play in Air, and also an counter essays and a critics. He also co-edited an editions of Shakespeare's play. So here we can also talk about Samuel Johnson's in poetry. First of all, he offers the first one is London and the Vanity of Human Wishes. Both poems here, both are modeled on general satires, and London describes here the various problems of London during his poems. And the second poem also, The Vanity of a Human and Wishes, even the most desired things such as being beautiful or living a long life could turn to be tragic ones. So if we want to talk about Samuel Johnson's, we have many things to talk. First of all, what he referred to as Dr. Johnson's. We can say that Samuel Johnson or Dr. Johnson's, and he was also an English writer, as just now we say, who made lasting contributions to English literatures as a poet and the playwright also. So the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography describes Johnson's as also the most distinguished man of letter in English history. We consider also him as a subject of James Powson when he said that the life of Samuel Johnson described by Walter Jackson's Peart and the most famous single work of biographical art in the whole of literatures. So this is what we can say about Samuel Johnson's and his poetry. Now, as you see here, with Johnson's who succeeded Dryden's and Pope in the chief place of English literature, and the classic movements had largely spent its force, and later half of the 18th century gives us an imposing array of writers who differ so widely that is almost impossible to classify them. In general, three schools of writers are noticeable. So I underline here because it is important. The first is the classist who under Johnson's lead insisted upon elegant and regularity of styles. The second here is the romantic poet like Collins, Gray, Thomason, and also the Pern, who revolted from Pope's artificial couplet and wrote of natures and the human heart. And finally, the third one is the early novelists like Defoe and Fieldings, Henry Fieldings here, who introduced a new type of literature. So this is everything about Johnson's here and or Dr. Johnson's, which you have also to read it more and more one time. So we are going here to finish this lecture and end this lecture. And before I finish and ended it, let me also tell you about the next lecture. In next lecture, I'll give you the um, I'll complete or we will complete this chapter number 9. And in this section, the next section in chapter number 9, we will discuss the revival of romantic poetry, the first section, and the second is William Black. William Black, what he also offered to 18th century here, the songs of innocence and songs of experience written by William Black. We will discuss also and talk about it. And the third point or section, I'll give you Henry Fielding's also as a novelist. And also I'll give you the novel of Henry Fielding's, his masterpieces, let me say, Joseph Andrew. Joseph Andrew is the masterpieces of Henry Fielding's. We will also take and talk about his poetry and his work in general. Finally, I'll give you the summary of the English, or sorry, the summary of the 18th century. And here we will finish it, the chapter number 9. Next lecture, it will be finished, inshallah, by these sections. Section number 1, the revival of romantic poetry. Section number 2, William Black. Section number 3 is Henry Fielding's. And number 4, finally, summary of the 18th century. So until I'll meet you, inshallah, until I'll meet you, let me say goodbye and see you.